It was August 13th, 1978, a date that would disappear from Canadian newspapers almost as completely as the 7 people who vanished that day. In a nation obsessed with tracking its citizens' movements, 7 members of the Mitchell family stepped into a remote cabin in the Cariboo region of British Columbia and simply ceased to exist. No ransom notes, no bodies, no credible witnesses, just empty air where a family used to be. Eleanor Mitchell, 42 years old, had written to her sister just days before the trip. "The children are excited," she'd said in a handwritten note that would later be carefully preserved by her family as one of the last pieces of evidence that she'd ever existed. David found this beautiful cabin rental for next to nothing. Remote, quiet, perfect for us to reconnect as a family. "Sometimes I think we all need to escape from the world for a while. The city feels suffocating lately. I can't quite explain it to David, but there's something about getting back to nature that feels like coming home. Maybe it's something we've lost as a society, that connection to something larger than ourselves, something wilder and more authentic than the lives we live day to day." Those words, written in Eleanor's careful cursive handwriting, would take on an almost prophetic quality after she disappeared. She had spoken of escape, of the world feeling suffocating. She had found her escape, though not in the way she had intended. They never came back. When their relatives began making phone calls on August 17th, searching for the family after they'd missed several important gatherings, David's mother's birthday celebration, a school registration meeting for the younger children, they discovered something that would set off alarms throughout British Columbia's Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The cabin was empty. The vehicle they'd driven, a 1974 Ford station wagon, white with wood paneling on the sides, the kind of family car that was ubiquitous in the 1970s, was parked outside, undisturbed, as if waiting for passengers who would never arrive. The keys were on the front seat. The engine was cold. Inside the cabin, they found overturned furniture, broken glass, and evidence of a violent struggle that investigators would later describe in their files as inconclusive. That word, inconclusive, would become a recurring theme in the official investigation. Inconclusive evidence, inconclusive interviews, inconclusive leads. Everything pointed somewhere, but nowhere with the kind of absolute certainty that would stand up in court or justify a definitive conclusion. But the real mystery wasn't what had happened inside that cabin. It was what happened afterward. It was the wall of silence that descended over the investigation. It was the way official channels seemed to move with unusual speed to close the case. Almost. Desperately so. Within just 90 days. It was the institutional effort to prevent the case from becoming what it was becoming. A national obsession. A symbol of something darker lurking beneath the surface of Canadian society. And it was the persistent, terrifying rumors about a religious community hidden deep in those same mountains, a community that seemed to operate outside the law, that locals warned visitors never to speak about, and that investigators appeared to be protecting rather than investigating. This is the story of the Mitchell family. This is what happened in the Cariboo. This is why, 47 years later, we still don't know where they are, and why there are people who believe that powerful forces have worked to keep it that way. To understand what happened to the Mitchell family, we must first understand the place and time in which they vanished, and we must understand who they were, because they were not abstractions. They were real people with real lives, real hopes, and real futures that were stolen from them. The year was 1978. Canada was still defining itself as a nation independent from its British colonial past. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was leading the country through a period of cultural experimentation and social flux. The Trudeau government was attempting to forge a new national identity, one that embraced multiculturalism, that welcomed immigrants from diverse backgrounds, that sought to distinguish Canada from the United States through a kind of cosmopolitan progressivism. It was an optimistic vision, but it existed in tension with traditional values and conservative social forces that still dominated much of the country, particularly in rural areas. Across North America, people were questioning authority in ways they hadn't before. The counterculture that had flowered in the 1960s had not died in the 1970s. It had evolved and splintered into 1,000 different movements. Some people were experimenting with drugs. Others were pursuing spiritual enlightenment through Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism. Still others were attempting to build alternative communities that operated outside the mainstream economy and social structures. People were rejecting conventional definitions of success. They were seeking authenticity in a world that felt increasingly artificial. This spiritual seeking was genuine and often noble, but it also created vulnerability. People searching for meaning were sometimes prey for those who offered false certainty, false community, false enlightenment wrapped in the language of spirituality, but built on manipulation, control, and exploitation. British Columbia, in particular, was a magnet for this alternative movement. The province's vast wilderness, millions of acres of remote forest, mountain passes, and isolated valleys, offered something that crowded cities and suburbs could never provide: true escape. People came to BC fleeing broken lives, seeking spiritual awakening, or simply wanting to disappear from the world they'd known. Vancouver was becoming a center of countercultural activity. The mountains and forests were becoming refugees for people seeking to build new ways of living. The Cariboo region, specifically, was a frontier land in the truest sense. It sat roughly 7 to 8 hours' drive northeast of Vancouver, accessible primarily through Highway 97, the main artery that connected southern British Columbia to the interior and the north. The landscape was unforgiving and magnificent in equal measure. Towering pine forests that seemed to stretch infinitely, vast stretches of virtually uninhabited territory, and mountains that seemed to swallow sound itself, as if they existed in a different universe than the one inhabited by ordinary people. Small towns like Quesnel and Williams Lake served as the region's economic and social centers, but outside these towns, civilization felt like a distant memory. The forest would close in around you. The distances between human settlements would stretch out. You could drive for hours and encounter nothing but trees, sky, and the sound of your own engine. In 1978, the Cariboo was experiencing its own quiet transformation. Tourism was beginning to develop, but it was still largely a place of loggers, miners, ranchers, and outdoorsmen. Hotels were few and far between. Cabin rentals, particularly the kind advertised as remote experiences in small classified sections of newspapers, were often operated by individuals rather than larger companies. There was minimal oversight. Rental agreements were often handled by mail or telephone. Background checks on renters were virtually non-existent. It was, in short, a place where a family could rent an isolated cabin, and the wider world might never even know they were there. It was a place where people could disappear. The Mitchell family itself was unremarkable in the most profound sense. They were the very definition of ordinary. And in many ways, that ordinariness was important to their story, because it meant they had nothing that should have marked them as special victims. They were simply people, and that made what happened to them all the more haunting. David William Mitchell was 44 years old in 1978. He was born in Toronto in 1934, and had moved west in his early 20s, looking for opportunity and new beginnings. He was a middle management accountant for a forestry company in Prince George, a position he had held for 9 years. He was described by colleagues as quiet, reliable, punctual, a man who did his work well without seeking attention or advancement. He maintained his job steadily, provided well for his family, and had no criminal record. He didn't drink heavily or associate with questionable characters. He attended church occasionally and was known to be a man of conventional morality and traditional values. He wore his hair short in the style of the time. He drove responsibly. He was, in every practical sense, the kind of man that society was built on: solid, dependable, ordinary. One colleague, Robert Sherman, would later recall, "David wasn't exciting. He wasn't the kind of guy you'd remember if you passed him on the street. He was just a good man, doing his job, taking care of his family. He represented something now old-fashioned: responsibility, commitment, I think that's partly what made it so shocking when he disappeared. He wasn't the kind of person that bad things happened to. He was the kind of person that bad things should never happen to. Eleanor Margaret Mitchell, A.N.A. Thornton, was 42 years old in 1978. She was born in Vancouver and had studied to become a teacher, graduating from the University of British Columbia with a degree in elementary education. She had taught at a public school in Prince George for 5 years before stepping back from full-time work when their youngest child was born. Neighbors described her as devoted, kind, always thinking of others. She was known to be actively involved in the school community and was respected as someone who cared deeply about children's education. She had a warm personality and an approachable manner that made people comfortable in her presence. She read widely, loved classical music, and had a small garden where she grew vegetables and flowers. She wrote regularly to her sister Margaret, long, thoughtful letters that reflected on life, family, and her hopes for her children's futures. One of her former students, now a woman in her 50s, would say many years later, "Mrs. Mitchell was one of the few teachers I remember from elementary school, not because she was stern or demanding, but because she actually cared about us as individuals. She remembered things about our lives. She asked follow-up questions. She treated children with a kind of respect that wasn't common in that era." Their 5 children ranged in age from 16 years old down to 5 years old, and each was a distinct personality in their own right. Catherine Margaret Mitchell was 16 years old in August 1978. She was a high school sophomore, intelligent and creative, with a passion for photography that had only recently emerged. She had received a camera as a birthday present the year before, and had spent the following year teaching herself composition, lighting, and darkroom technique through books borrowed from the library. She wanted to pursue photography as a career and had begun to develop a portfolio of local landscapes. She was quiet and thoughtful, the kind of teenager who observed the world carefully before participating in it. Her teachers noted her intelligence and her ability to see nuance in complex issues. She had a small group of close friends rather than a large social circle, and she was close to her mother, who encouraged her intellectual and creative development. James Robert Mitchell was 13 years old in August 1978. He was an athlete and an outdoorsman, the kind of boy who loved hunting and fishing and exploring wild places. He was also a voracious reader of adventure fiction, Jack London, Ernest Hemingway, survival narratives. He dreamed of being a wildlife biologist or a wilderness guide. He was athletic and energetic, always in motion, always looking for the next adventure, but he was also sensitive and thoughtful in unexpected ways. He kept a journal of his observations about nature. He wrote poetry about the forest. Teachers noted that he was bright and capable, though he didn't always apply himself in classroom settings. He was close to his father, who shared his love of outdoor pursuits. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell was 9 years old in August 1978. She was in 4th grade, a bright and social child who had many friends, and who was beginning to develop her own distinct personality separate from her family. She was artistic, with a particular talent for drawing, and she was beginning to show early signs of the woman she would become: intelligent, independent, witty. She was the kind of child that teachers noted as having leadership potential. She was also sensitive to the emotions of others, often the first to notice when someone was upset, and to try to comfort them. She had a warm relationship with all her family members and no particular conflicts or difficulties in her young life. Robert James Mitchell was 7 years old in August 1978. He was in 2nd grade, an energetic and curious boy who was still very much in the stage of childhood where everything was new and wondered at. He had recently learned to read and was discovering the joy of books. He was athletic and playful, still possessed of the innocent unself-consciousness of childhood. Teachers described him as well-adjusted and bright. He had a close relationship with his younger brother. Thomas David Mitchell was 5 years old in August 1978. He was in kindergarten, still very young, still possessing that quality of profound innocence that characterizes very young children. He was verbal and social, already showing signs of his own personality. He was mischievous and funny, the kind of child who could make the whole family laugh with his observations and his unexpected comments. He was still very dependent on his parents, still at the age where the world revolved around their presence and their protection. He had recently asked his mother what would happen if she went away, and Eleanor had reassured him that she would never leave him. These 7 people, David, Eleanor, Catherine, James, Sarah, Robert, and Thomas, were a family. They had their own dynamics, their own tensions, their own particular ways of loving each other. Catherine and James sometimes bickered in the way older siblings do. Thomas occasionally frustrated Robert with his younger brother antics. David worked long hours and sometimes came home tired, which created occasional friction. Eleanor sometimes felt the strain of managing 5 children, but they loved each other. This was evident in photographs, in the testimony of those who knew them, in the letters Eleanor wrote to her sister. They were not perfect, but they were real, and they were together. And then, for reasons that remain unclear, they drove north into the Cariboo region and vanished. By early August 1978, the family had decided to take a vacation. The previous winter had been long and difficult. Prince George experiences harsh winters with temperatures that can drop below -30 degrees Celsius. Spring had been cold and wet. The family had been somewhat isolated during those months, cooped up in their house during the worst weather. Eleanor had written to her sister Margaret that she felt the need to refresh and reconnect as a family, and David had agreed. David had been looking for affordable vacation options when he stopped at a rest area along Highway 97 in early August. There, he found a brochure advertising rustic cabin rentals throughout British Columbia. One cabin in particular had caught his eye. It was listed simply as Cariboo Retreat, private, quiet, perfect for families seeking solitude, beautiful forest setting, fully equipped, $200 for the week. $200 was affordable for a middle-class family in 1978, roughly equivalent to $800 in modern currency. It was cheap enough that David and Eleanor could justify it as a reasonable vacation expense. The description appealed to David's sense of wanting to get his family away from the stresses of normal life. Eleanor, when he showed her the brochure, had agreed that it sounded wonderful. According to Eleanor's letters, David had made inquiries by telephone to a number listed in the brochure. The cabin's owner, a man who identified himself only as Robert, had quoted the $200 weekly rate and had asked very few questions about the family or their intentions. He had not required them to provide references or extensive information. He had simply requested that payment be sent in advance by mail. David had written a check, addressed it to a post office box, and sent it off. No contract was ever signed. No detailed directions were provided beyond, follow Highway 97 north to the turnoff near Quesnel, then follow the logging road approximately 30 kilometers east. You can't miss it. No reservation confirmation was sent. It was all remarkably casual and informal, a transaction that, in the 1970s, could still be conducted with minimal paperwork and mutual trust. Eleanor had written to Margaret, "It feels spontaneous and adventurous, which is somewhat unlike David, but I think that's part of what I like about it. He's usually so cautious, so methodical, but for this, he just sent the check and said we'll figure out the rest when we get there. There's something romantic about that, don't you think?" By August 13th, 1978, the Mitchell family had packed their station wagon with camping equipment, food, clothing, and the kind of optimistic excitement that comes before a planned vacation. Eleanor had taken time off from her teaching position. David had arranged to be away from work. Catherine had brought her camera and several rolls of film so she could practice her photography in a new environment. James had brought books to read during the quiet evenings and had packed his fishing equipment, hoping to find streams in the forest where he could fish. Sarah had brought her sketchbook and colored pencils. Robert had brought his favorite toys. Thomas had brought his stuffed animal, a worn rabbit that he'd had since he was a baby. Eleanor had prepared food for the journey, sandwiches and fruit and cheese that they could eat in the car. She'd packed first aid supplies and extra medications. She'd made sure everyone had appropriate clothing for the forest environment. She was, in short, a mother preparing to take her children on what should have been an ordinary vacation. It seemed like it would be a perfect week. They drove north on Highway 97, watching the landscape gradually shift from rolling farmland to dense forest. They passed through towns that grew progressively smaller: Vanderhoof, Burns Lake, Smithers. With each passing mile, the world seemed to become wilder and less inhabited. They passed through forests that grew progressively denser and more primordial. David drove while Eleanor navigated using a highway map. They stopped at a rest area to stretch their legs. Thomas fell asleep in the back seat. Catherine took photographs out the car window. James read. Sarah drew pictures. Robert played with a toy car. When they reached the turnoff near Quesnel, they left the highway and began following the logging road into increasingly remote territory. The road was rough and unpaved, rutted with deep tracks from logging trucks and heavy equipment. It wound through dense forest. There were no other cars, no sign of civilization, just forest and road and sky. No one in the wider world knew where they were going. No one knew how to reach them. They had left no detailed itinerary with family or friends. David had mentioned at work that he would be away for a week, but had been vague about the destination. Eleanor had mentioned to her principal that she would be on vacation, but had not specified where. They had said they would call when they arrived at the cabin to confirm everything was fine. But those calls would never come. By the time the rest of the world began searching for them 4 days later, the Mitchells had already been gone long enough for almost anything to happen. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came not through official channels, but through the simple fact of missed communication. Eleanor's sister Margaret lived in Vancouver with her husband and 2 teenage children. Margaret and Eleanor had always been close. They spoke by telephone every Sunday without fail. It was a ritual they'd maintained for nearly 20 years, ever since Eleanor had moved to Prince George after her marriage. Sunday evening phone calls, the 2 sisters catching up on their weeks, sharing news about their families, discussing their hopes and concerns. It was one of the few consistent connections Eleanor maintained with her family of origin after moving away from the lower mainland. Eleanor had mentioned the cabin vacation while they'd talked on August 6th, just a week before the family was due to depart. Margaret had thought nothing of it. People went on vacations. People took road trips. There was nothing unusual or alarming about any of it. Eleanor had sounded happy, excited even, in a way that Margaret hadn't heard in some time. "We need this," Eleanor had said. "All of us. The family needs time to be together without distractions. David's been working so hard. The children are growing so fast. Sometimes I worry that we're just going through the motions of family life without actually connecting. This trip feels like it might change that." Margaret had been touched by her sister's words and had encouraged the vacation enthusiastically. She'd asked Eleanor to call when they returned so that she could hear all about it. But when Sunday, August 20th, came around and Eleanor didn't call, Margaret felt a slight flutter of concern. Eleanor was not the kind of person who forgot routine obligations. She was reliable and organized. She had never, in Margaret's recollection, missed their Sunday phone call, even when Eleanor's children were sick, even when she'd been struggling with depression, even when family crises had occurred. The phone call was sacred, something that Eleanor protected and preserved. Margaret waited until evening, expecting that perhaps Eleanor was simply running late with something. When the phone didn't ring by 10 o'clock, Margaret made a decision. She called Eleanor's house in Prince George. The line rang and rang, unanswered. Margaret waited, thinking perhaps David and Eleanor were simply out of the house. She tried again an hour later. Still nothing. She tried once more before going to bed, this time letting the phone ring longer. Still no answer. By Monday morning, August 21st, Margaret was genuinely concerned. She called again, multiple times throughout the day. Nothing. She considered whether it was possible that Eleanor and David had extended their vacation by a few days, but Eleanor had been very specific about their return date. They were supposed to arrive back on August 18th or 19th at the latest. Eleanor had mentioned that she needed to prepare for the school year that would begin shortly. Margaret called David's workplace in Prince George. She got through to his supervisor, a man named Kenneth Walsh, who seemed mildly surprised by the call. Walsh confirmed that David had mentioned taking a week off for a family vacation, but said he hadn't been told exactly when David would return. "I just assumed he'd be back sometime this week," Walsh said. "It's not unusual for employees to be vague about vacation schedules. We're not a military operation. People take time when they need it." This didn't reassure Margaret. In fact, it deepened her concern, because Eleanor had specifically told her that they would be back by August 18th at the latest. Margaret asked David's supervisor if there had been any messages from David or Eleanor, any indication of why they hadn't returned as expected. Walsh said there hadn't been. By Monday evening, Margaret had made a decision. She called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Prince George and reported her sister's family missing. She spoke to a constable named Frank Mitchell, no relation to the missing family, who took her information in a somewhat bureaucratic manner. Mitchell asked standard questions. How long had the family been away? Where were they going? Had there been any indication of family problems or reasons why they might not want to return? Was it possible they were simply extending their vacation? Margaret answered his questions patiently, but she could hear in his voice that he didn't consider this particularly urgent. Missing people reports were common. Most of them resolved themselves within a few hours or days. People went on vacations and lost track of time. People decided to extend trips. People didn't always communicate clearly with family members about their plans. But Margaret was insistent. There were 5 children involved. Eleanor was not the kind of person to simply vanish without contacting her family. Something was wrong. The RCMP's response was initially bureaucratic. A missing person report was filed, but the investigating officers, Constables Frank Mitchell and John Thornton, didn't immediately treat it as a crisis. Standard procedure was to wait 72 hours before initiating a full search. This policy existed partly because most missing persons were found quickly, partly because initiating an immediate full-scale search for every missing person report would consume resources that could be deployed elsewhere. But Margaret's persistence, combined with the fact that there were 5 children involved, combined with the fact that Eleanor had a history of being reliable and responsible, accelerated the timeline. By Tuesday, August 22nd, 9 days after the family had driven into the Cariboo, RCMP officers had contacted the cabin's supposedly listed owner. This was where the investigation immediately encountered its first major obstacle, the first of many obstacles that would hamper the investigation and ultimately contribute to its premature closure. The telephone number provided in the classified ad for the cabin rental connected to a message service in a small office building in Prince George. The operator who answered had never heard of anyone named Robert renting cabins. She had a note on file from approximately 4 months earlier, indicating roughly April 1978, showing that someone had rented a post office box through her service and had placed advertisements for vacation accommodations in regional classified publications. But the person had abandoned the mailbox after 3 months, paying only for the initial period and leaving no forwarding address. The office had attempted to follow up, but the original renter had never responded to inquiries. When the initial payment period expired, the post office box had been reassigned to someone else. Investigators tried to trace the original payment. The check that David Mitchell had sent had been cashed, but they couldn't determine who had cashed it without access to bank records, and in 1978, bank records were not as easily accessible as they would become in later decades. Getting bank records required time and legal procedures. Within hours, the RCMP realized they couldn't even locate the cabin. The description of its location, 30 kilometers east of Highway 97 near Quesnel, on an old logging road, was far too vague. The Cariboo region contained hundreds of old logging roads, many of them barely maintained or completely abandoned. Some were shown on maps, but many were not. The wilderness expanded in all directions like an ocean, and a small cabin hidden among millions of trees could be virtually impossible to find without precise coordinates or someone who knew exactly where it was. By Wednesday, August 23rd, 10 days after the family had driven into the Cariboo, the RCMP had mobilized search teams. They distributed flyers with photographs of the Mitchell family throughout the Cariboo region. They contacted every hotel, gas station, restaurant, and local business in Quesnel and surrounding towns to see if anyone had seen a 1974 Ford station wagon driven by a middle-aged man with 5 children. They interviewed forest rangers, park officials, and locals who knew the area. They posted notices on community boards. They made radio announcements on local stations asking for information. The search became gradually more organized and more extensive. By late August, authorities had assembled teams of volunteers and off-duty officers to comb the region. They brought in tracking dogs. They organized systematic searches of accessible areas of forest. They set up checkpoints on highways asking drivers if they'd seen the family. The search effort was extensive and coordinated and desperate. And then, on Saturday, August 26th, 13 days after the family was reported missing, and 13 days after they'd driven into the forest, a forest ranger named Thomas Delacroix found them. Delacroix was conducting routine maintenance work on one of the old logging roads when he noticed a vehicle parked near an overgrown turnoff. It was a station wagon, white with wood paneling on the sides, matching the description that had been circulated in the missing persons alert. When he approached, he found a cabin approximately 200 meters down a barely passable track. Delacroix radioed the RCMP immediately. Within 2 hours, the first police officers arrived at the scene. What they found inside the cabin would shock them, and eventually shock the nation. The front door was closed but unlocked. Inside, investigators found a scene of undeniable chaos and violence. The main room of the cabin showed evidence of a struggle that could not be explained away as accidental or innocent. A heavy wooden table was overturned, its legs splintered. Chairs were scattered across the floor, some of them broken. Broken glass lay on the floor, from glasses and dishes, investigators would later determine. There were blood stains on the wooden surfaces of tables and floor, multiple stains indicating that multiple people had been bleeding. There were scratch marks on the walls, as if something or someone had been dragged forcefully across them. In the sleeping quarters, a back room with several bunk beds, the scene was similarly disturbing. Bedding was torn and disturbed. Some of the family's belongings, clothing, personal items, were scattered throughout the cabin, but notably, several items were missing entirely. The suitcases were still there, but some of the clothes that presumably should have been packed inside them were gone. Some of the family's toiletries were missing. Some of the children's belongings, toys, books, were gone, though others remained. It was as if someone had been in the process of removing certain items from the cabin and had been interrupted or had completed their task partially. All 7 members of the Mitchell family were gone. There was no sign of where they had gone. There were no notes. There were no indications of the direction they'd traveled. There were no bodies. In the cabin's small kitchen, investigators found something else. A child's drawing. It was a crude pencil sketch on a piece of lined paper, apparently drawn by someone young, judged to be a child perhaps 5 to 8 years old. It depicted figures that appeared to be wearing robes or long clothing, standing over or surrounding smaller figures. The lines were uncertain and childlike. The meaning was ambiguous, but its very existence raised immediate questions. Had the drawing been made by one of the children before they'd gone to the cabin, or had it been made while they were there? Was it just the product of a child's imagination, perhaps young Thomas drawing a story or a fantasy? Or was it evidence of something witnessed, something real, something terrifying? Investigators carefully photographed the drawing, but did not remove it immediately, concerned that it might contain forensic evidence. The discovery of the cabin transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a potential crime scene. The RCMP brought in forensic specialists from Prince George. The cabin was cordoned off with yellow tape. Photographs were taken of every surface. Evidence was cataloged and collected. The blood found in the cabin was analyzed using the forensic techniques available in 1978, testing for blood type and other basic characteristics. All of the blood found was determined to be human. The blood types matched the blood types of various family members, consistent with what one might expect if people had been injured during a struggle. Yet there were no bodies. There were no remains. There were no signs of where the missing people had gone. It was as if 7 human beings had simply dematerialized, as if they had been erased from physical reality. More disturbing still, investigators discovered the cabin's visitor log, a simple notebook where previous renters were apparently supposed to sign in with their names and the dates of their stay. When officers examined it, they found something that deepened the mystery and raised new questions. The Mitchell family's names had been written in the log, dated August 13, 1978. The handwriting appeared to be David's, but beneath their names, in a different handwriting and apparently written at the same time or around the same time, were 3 other entries. These entries listed names that investigators later discovered were almost certainly false. John Peterson, August 5-8, 1978. Michael Davies, August 8-12, 1978. Robert Williams, ongoing. The names meant nothing to investigators initially. Background checks revealed no such people living in the province or anywhere in Western Canada. Records showed no driver's licenses or identification documents under these names. It was as if someone had created fake identities and recorded them in the log, perhaps to create the false impression that the cabin had other legitimate renters, perhaps to confuse any investigation that might later examine the log. Why would someone do this? To establish an alibi? To confuse any investigation that might later examine the log? Or was there a darker purpose? To create a record showing that other people had been at the cabin, to potentially blame outsiders for whatever had happened. As investigators examined the log more carefully, they noticed something else. The handwriting in the fake entries was different from David Mitchell's handwriting. This meant that someone other than David had written these false entries. Someone else had been at the cabin. Someone else had used a pen to write down fictional names in a cabin visitor log while the Mitchell family was present. This suggested premeditation, planning, the existence of a system or protocol. It suggested that whoever had been at the cabin had expected that there might be an investigation and had taken steps in advance to confuse or mislead that investigation. News of the discovery spread quickly through the Cariboo region and eventually throughout British Columbia. Local news outlets ran headlines: "Family of 7 vanishes, foul play suspected." Radio stations interrupted regular programming with updates. Within a week, the case had become a national story. Canadian newspapers compared it to other famous missing persons cases. Magazines ran feature articles. Television news programs dedicated significant coverage to the story. The case captured public imagination in a way that few missing persons cases did. Perhaps it was the size of the family. Perhaps it was the ordinariness of the victims. They were not people on the margins of society, not people whose disappearance might be explained by involvement in criminal activity or drug use. They were a stable, middle-class family. They were people that anyone might identify with. Perhaps it was also the mystery of it. The cabin with signs of violence but no bodies. The false names in the visitor log. The suggestion that something deliberate and organized had happened, rather than a random crime. Theories emerged in newspapers and in conversations in coffee shops and living rooms throughout Canada. Could it be a kidnapping? A murder? A cult abduction? Could the family have been taken by someone? Transported somewhere else? Were they still alive somewhere? Or were they dead? Their bodies hidden in the forest, waiting to be discovered. Families across the province began to feel an undercurrent of fear. If a stable, ordinary family could simply disappear in broad daylight, if 7 people could be taken from a cabin in the remote forest with apparently minimal resistance, who was safe? What protection did ordinary life offer against whatever force had taken the Mitchells? But then, as quickly as the story had appeared in public consciousness, it began to fade. The RCMP investigation into the Mitchell family's disappearance was, by the records that remain available, surprisingly thorough in its initial stages. Detective Inspector Alan Carver was assigned to lead the investigation. Carver was an experienced investigator in his late 40s with more than 20 years of service in the RCMP. He had handled homicide cases, fraud cases, and complex investigations that spanned multiple jurisdictions and required coordination between different police agencies. By all accounts, he was competent, methodical, and professional. He was respected by his colleagues and was known for his ability to organize complex investigations and to maintain focus on evidence, rather than being swayed by theories or speculation. Carver reviewed the initial reports and made an immediate decision. This was not a case that could be handled routinely. This was a serious potential crime, likely a multiple homicide or abduction, and it required a significant investigative effort. Carver's first priority was to establish a complete and detailed timeline. He interviewed hotel staff in Quesnel and Williams Lake, asking whether anyone remembered seeing a family matching the Mitchells' description. He spoke with gas station attendants and restaurant workers who might have served the family or seen their vehicle. He collected statements from forest rangers and park officials about the area and about whether they had noticed anything unusual in the days before or after the family's disappearance. He organized the search parties that combed the wilderness for any sign of the missing people. These search efforts were extensive and methodical. Teams of volunteers and off-duty officers spread out into the forest, looking for any indication of where the family might have gone. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, remains, clothing, anything that might provide a clue. The search teams found virtually nothing that answered their fundamental questions. A few scattered items of clothing were located in the forest, approximately half a kilometer from the cabin. A child's shoe was found near a stream approximately 2 kilometers away, its condition suggesting it had been in the forest for some time. But no bodies, no bones, no remains of any kind, no graves or disturbed earth. It was as if the earth had simply opened and swallowed 7 human beings, leaving no trace of where they had gone. This absence of remains presented investigators with a puzzle. If the family had been killed in or near the cabin, where were the bodies? The forest was vast, certainly, but disposing of 7 bodies, including 5 children, would not be simple or quick. It would require time and knowledge and access to resources. It would be difficult to do without leaving traces. Had the family been taken elsewhere? Had their bodies been transported away from the cabin to some other location? Or was there some other explanation entirely? Carver began to focus his investigation on 2 parallel lines of inquiry. The first line focused on identifying the mysterious Robert, who had rented out the cabin. Who was this person? Where did he come from? Did he have a criminal history? Was he still in the region? Or had he disappeared? The second line focused on the idea that someone had been at the cabin with the family. The false entries in the visitor log suggested premeditation. The physical evidence of struggle suggested multiple people might have been involved. Investigators began to pursue the theory that the family had not been alone at the cabin, that someone or someones had been there with them, and that these other people were responsible for what had happened. In mid-September, investigators began to intensify their efforts to identify Robert and to trace the cabin rental. They placed advertisements in newspapers asking for information about anyone who had rented cabins in the Cariboo region during the months before the family's disappearance. They contacted real estate agencies, property managers, and anyone else who might have information about rural property rentals in the area. They received several tips from the public. Following the classic pattern of missing persons investigations where tips come in from many sources, most of them dead ends, a few of them potentially valuable. Some tips led nowhere, but one lead proved intriguing and would eventually become the focus of Carver's investigation. A woman named Patricia Grayson contacted the RCMP after seeing an advertisement asking for information about cabin rentals. She claimed that her former neighbor, a man named Robert Sutherland, had been running an illegal cabin rental operation in the Cariboo. She said that Sutherland was affiliated with a religious community living in the mountains, and that he often used the cabin for recruitment purposes, meaning he would bring people to the cabin who might be interested in joining the community. She said Sutherland was charismatic, but also unsettling, that there was something about him that made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite articulate what. She couldn't provide a current address, but she believed Sutherland was still operating in the area, though she hadn't seen him recently. Investigators followed this lead with intensity. They discovered that Robert Sutherland had indeed lived in the area. According to local records, Sutherland had rented a small property on the outskirts of Williams Lake from approximately 1974 to 1977. The property appeared to be used for short-term lodging and office space. Sutherland had apparently run various small businesses from the location, including what appeared to be a travel agency or vacation rental service. But Sutherland himself was proving elusive. He had apparently moved from the property sometime in 1977 or early 1978. The current tenant had never met him. The property management company had no forwarding address. When investigators checked driver's license records, they found that Sutherland's license had expired in 1976 and had never been renewed. He apparently had no registered address in the province after 1977 or 1978. He had vanished, just as the Mitchell family had vanished. Here, the investigation took a turn that would prove decisive and deeply controversial. Detective Carver began to focus his investigative attention not primarily on finding the missing family, but on what he termed the religious community operating in the mountains. According to interviews that Carver conducted with locals in Quesnel and surrounding areas, there were persistent rumors about a group of approximately 30 to 50 people living in a compound approximately 40 to 50 kilometers northeast of Quesnel, in the remote mountains of the interior. The group was described as being involved in various alternative religious practices. Some described it as quasi-Buddhist. Others said it had elements of New Age spirituality, mixed with other esoteric practices. One local reporter who had attempted to investigate the community in 1977 described it in her notes as cultish, organized, deliberately isolated, and concerning from a community safety perspective. The community kept to itself. Its members rarely ventured into town. When they did, they bought supplies and left quickly, saying little to local shopkeepers or other business people. They seemed to be self-sufficient, operating their own gardens and presumably other resources to maintain themselves. The locals, meanwhile, seemed to harbor a mixture of fear and indifference toward the community. Some people seemed genuinely frightened when the community was mentioned. Others affected an attitude of not caring what happened up in the mountains, as long as it didn't affect the towns and settled areas. But there was an undercurrent of fear in the region when the community was discussed. Several people warned investigators that asking too many questions about the community could be dangerous. One gas station owner, Herbert Walsh, told Detective Carver, "That group keeps their own counsel. I'd suggest you do the same if you know what's good for you." When Carver pressed Walsh for more details about what he meant and what he was warning against, Walsh became evasive and would say no more. This response was interesting to Carver. Walsh seemed genuinely frightened. He seemed to be warning Carver out of something like concern for Carver's safety. But of what? What was Walsh afraid of? Carver began to compile information about this community. He assigned officers to interview people who had had contact with the community. He collected reports, some of them from townspeople, some of them from people who had apparently had brief interactions with community members. He began to develop a file on what he believed were some of the community's leaders and members. What emerged from these interviews was a picture of an organization, and it clearly was organized in a formal sense, that practiced various forms of control over its members. People reported that community members were isolated from the outside world. There were allegations of coercive practices, group manipulation, pressure to remain within the community, pressure not to maintain outside relationships. Reports suggested the group was involved in selling illegal substances, marijuana, and possibly other drugs, which provided income and also potentially leverage over members who might want to leave. One report came from a woman who said her daughter had been involved with the community briefly and had escaped. The daughter, according to the woman, had described practices of sleep deprivation, constant meditation and group work, restricted diet, and psychological manipulation designed to break down individual identity and replace it with group identity. The daughter had described fear and control as the dominant forces within the community. By late September 1978, Carver had compiled a file on this religious community that ran to dozens of pages. It included names of what he believed were leaders and members, descriptions of the compound's location, theories about the group's spiritual beliefs and practices, and a growing body of evidence that suggested the group engaged in activities that ranged from unusual to potentially criminal. But Carver was also careful. He knew that his investigation was becoming increasingly speculative. He knew that he was moving into territory where evidence was limited and theories were expanding. He knew that he needed to be careful about not allowing his suspicions to run ahead of his evidence. Then, in early October 1978, something happened that would abruptly change the trajectory of the investigation, and that would eventually lead to its termination. Detective Carver was called into a meeting with RCMP brass, specifically with a superintendent named Douglas Harris, who oversaw operations for the region. The meeting took place in Harris's office in Prince George on October 3, 1978. According to the limited information that has ever been made public about this meeting, Carver presented his findings to Harris and recommended that the investigation be expanded to include a detailed investigation of the religious community. Carver argued that the evidence, the connection between Robert Sutherland and the community, the reports of the community's practices, the false names in the visitor log, the evidence of organized activity, suggested a strong possibility that the community was involved in the Mitchell family's disappearance. Harris, according to accounts of the meeting that came from Carver's colleagues, listened to Carver's presentation and then made a decision that shocked Carver. Harris told Carver that the investigation into the Mitchell family's disappearance was to be suspended. Harris justified the decision by claiming that without bodies or definitive evidence of a crime by specific individuals, the investigation could not continue indefinitely. He noted that search teams had been deployed for nearly 7 weeks with no results. He suggested that it was possible the family had left voluntarily, or that they had met with an accident in the wilderness that was unlikely to be resolved without additional leads. He said that continuing to pursue theories about a religious community without specific evidence linking specific individuals to the disappearance was not a responsible use of departmental resources. Carver apparently objected to this decision strongly. According to a brief note in his personnel file, one of the few details of this meeting that has ever been recorded, Carver stated his belief that the community in the mountains was involved in the disappearance and that ending the E.D.I. investigation was premature. He argued that the pattern of evidence suggested organized criminal activity, and that failing to investigate further would be a dereliction of duty. Harris, according to this same note, told Carver that he had no evidence of involvement by any third party, and that pursuing further leads would not be a responsible use of departmental resources. The investigation was officially closed on October 15, 1978, just 62 days after the family was reported missing. Carver was ordered to suspend all investigation into the case and to move on to other priorities. The case was filed away. No arrests were made. No charges were filed against anyone. The religious community in the mountains continued its existence, apparently undisturbed by law enforcement, and the Mitchell family remained missing, their fate unknown, their case relegated to the dusty files of unsolved disappearances. Several years later, Detective Carver would retire from the RCMP. Before retiring, he submitted a formal request that the Mitchell case be reopened, citing what he described as new information and leads that he believed warranted further investigation. Carver never publicly specified what this new information was, and his request was denied by his superiors. Carver died in 1995, taking whatever additional details he may have known about the investigation and about his reasons for believing the community was involved to his grave. In the decades following the Mitchell family's disappearance, their case faded from public memory with an almost deliberate completeness. The national news media, which had covered the discovery of the cabin extensively in August and September 1978, moved on to other stories. Subsequent disappearances and crimes captured public attention. The 1970s gave way to the 1980s, and the case of 7 missing people in rural British Columbia became a footnote, then a forgotten entry in police archives. Newspaper clippings about the case were filed away and forgotten in newspaper archives. Television programs moved on to fresh stories. The nation's attention, always seeking novelty and fresh scandal, moved away from the Mitchells. But for those who had been close to the family, the silence was unbearable in a way that's difficult to fully convey to people who haven't experienced it. It's one thing to grieve a death, to understand that a person is gone, to have closure even in the midst of grief, but it's another thing entirely to have a person simply vanish, to not know what happened, to not know whether they suffered, to not know where they are. This kind of loss doesn't allow for closure. It doesn't allow for real grieving. It just allows for endless questioning and wondering. Margaret, Eleanor's sister, spent years trying to resurrect the investigation. She wrote letters to government officials, to members of parliament, to the provincial Ministry of Justice, to anyone she thought might have the power to reopen the case. She contacted journalists, some of whom showed interest, but who found that the story had grown cold and that official channels were not receptive to revisiting it. She compiled her own file of information, interviewing people who had lived in the Cariboo region, collecting newspaper clippings, organizing everything into a detailed chronology. She reached out to family members and friends of the Mitchells, asking them to share what they remembered, what they had observed, what they thought might have happened. She became something of an amateur investigator, driven by the need to understand what had happened to her sister and her family. She even hired a private investigator in 1985 at considerable personal expense, money that was not easily spared by someone of her circumstances, to pursue leads that she felt the RCMP had abandoned. The private investigator, a former police officer named Michael Chen, conducted a thorough re-examination of the case. Chen reviewed the official files, interviewed locals who had never spoken to the RCMP or who had been interviewed but who might have additional information, collected old newspaper clippings from the 1978 investigation, and traveled to the remote cabin, which had stood abandoned for 7 years, and conducted his own examination of the scene. Chen's investigation was limited by the constraints of private investigation. He didn't have access to official records. He couldn't compel people to speak with him. He couldn't conduct forensic analysis, but he did what he could with the resources available to him. In a final report submitted to Margaret in 1986, Chen concluded, "The official closure of this case appears premature, and in my professional judgment, potentially indicative of official pressure to cease investigation. The evidence points toward involvement by an organized group, rather than a random crime. The abrupt termination of the official investigation suggests that someone in a position of authority made a deliberate decision to prevent further pursuit of this theory. While I cannot determine with certainty what happened to the Mitchell family, the pattern of evidence and the official response to that evidence suggest that answers exist and are being deliberately withheld or not pursued." Chen's report, however, remained private. It was never formally submitted to authorities. It received no media attention. It changed nothing in any official capacity. It was simply a document that Margaret kept, one more piece of evidence in a case that was being deliberately not investigated. Meanwhile, the religious community that had lived in the Cariboo Mountains seemed to vanish as well. By the early 1980s, locals noticed that the compound was less frequently occupied. By the mid-1980s, it appeared to be completely abandoned. The buildings remained, from what people could observe from a distance, but there was no sign of human habitation. What happened to the group? Whether they relocated voluntarily to another location, whether they were encouraged to leave by authorities, whether they dissolved naturally because members gradually left, was never clearly established. Some people in the region believed that the group had relocated to another part of British Columbia or to another province entirely. Others believed that they had simply dispersed, with individual members returning to normal society. Still others, those who had been most frightened of the group, believed that the group still existed, but had simply become more clandestine more hidden, more careful about not drawing attention to themselves. Margaret remained convinced throughout her life that the community was involved in her sister's disappearance. She attempted, numerous times throughout the 1980s and 1990s, to get police to investigate the community more thoroughly, but she was always met with official indifference. When she contacted the RCMP, she was told that reopening a closed case would require new evidence or new leads. When she presented the information she had compiled, police officials would listen politely, but would not commit to any investigation. One RCMP officer, when she contacted him in 1988, reportedly told her, "Those issues are complicated. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." Pursuing investigations into groups and communities can be sensitive. It's better not to disturb things that are better left alone. The message was clear, though never explicitly stated. The official position was that this case should remain closed, that the community should not be investigated, and that Margaret should stop pursuing it. Margaret did not stop, but she also could not force official action. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the case became the stuff of local legend in British Columbia, particularly in the Cariboo region where the disappearance had occurred. Stories were told around campfires in small mountain towns. Conspiracy theories circulated in whispers. Some people claimed that the family was being held prisoner by the cult, a theory that grew less plausible as the decades passed, and no evidence of such imprisonment ever emerged. Others believed they had been killed and buried in unmarked graves somewhere in the mountains. Still others speculated that government officials had been complicit in some kind of cover-up, either protecting the community or deliberately suppressing investigation into what had happened. But these were stories told by locals to locals. They didn't appear in mainstream media. They didn't prompt official inquiries. They were simply whispered stories in a region where people had learned. It seemed that asking too many questions could be dangerous, or at least could be futile. The physical cabin where the family had disappeared became a kind of dark landmark in the region, a place that held fascination and dread in equal measure. Urban explorers and adventure seekers occasionally attempted to locate it, drawn by the mystery and the historical significance, but its exact position in the vast Cariboo wilderness made it difficult to find without precise directions. A few people claimed to have reached it and reported finding it boarded up and apparently empty, though these claims were never verified by authorities. In 1995, a logging company began extensive clear-cutting operations in the area where the cabin had stood. The company apparently never found the structure, and it's possible the building was demolished or destroyed during the logging process. The exact location of the cabin has become uncertain over the decades. Some of the logging roads that might have led to it have been abandoned, overgrown by forest, or eliminated entirely through land management decisions. The cabin, if it still exists, has become almost impossible to find without specific knowledge of its location. By the 2000s, the Mitchell family's disappearance had become almost forgotten outside of British Columbia. Within the province, it lingered as a piece of obscure history, a tragedy that people knew about vaguely, but about which they remembered few details. Younger generations had not lived through the 1978 media coverage and could not understand the extent to which the case had once captured public attention. Margaret's children, Eleanor's nieces and nephews, grew up with the mystery as a background to their family history. They heard stories about the relatives they'd never met. They developed their own theories and questions. Eleanor's mother, the children's grandmother, grew old without ever knowing what had happened to her daughter and grandchildren. She died in 1998, never having received answers. But the living moved forward with their lives, as people do. They carried the loss and the uncertainty, but they also moved forward. The case remained technically open in bureaucratic terms. It was never officially closed in the formal sense, though neither was it actively investigated. It was simply abandoned, left in a kind of institutional limbo, neither solved nor forgotten, neither pursued nor officially abandoned. The 7 missing people remained missing,